Hello everyone, welcome to MS Art Live. I am Reddington and today I have a very special guest, Chris Reddington. Hi Chris, welcome, how are you?
Good, thank you, Mert. How are you doing?
Thank you, I am fine. And
Good.
today we are going to talk about Azure and DevOps, not only Azure DevOps but also other products. So my first question, as you know, about introduction. So can you please introduce yourself?
Of course, yes. So Chris Reddington, I was on the show, I think a couple of months ago now, actually, but
Yeah,
my
correct.
introduction my introduction changes now. I was a fast track engineer then. I'm now a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. So still at Microsoft, different role, but doing very similar things to what I was before. So I focus in the app development space, focus on DevOps, and helping customers be successful with Azure in that space. So, I see customers doing all different things using Azure DevOps, using GitHub, using other tools. So really just a chance today to talk through some DevOps concepts really and see where we go, I think.
Okay, so I want to ask about your new role. Congratulations, by the way. What's
Thank you.
the difference
In the blog, you mean?
of
Uh,
your new role and the previous role?
in the
I
job.
mean, the first track
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted a few things. I think you and I have spoken about this in the past. That we're enthusiastic about community and all the content, videos, and things that we do. And that was something I know in the cloud solution architectural they're very passionate about. Driving and developing the community. So that was an important reason for me to move and change roles. Also, I I'm a people person. I like working with people. I like building relationships. And in the fast track role, it was really about kind of go from one project to the next project to the next project, which is good. And I've been in that team for 4 years. But I wanted the new challenge. I wanted to focus more on the relationship side and working longer with certain customers, which is one of the main reasons moving to the cloud solution architect role. And I'm now aligned to a few customers rather than many different projects, and I get to build those relationships, understand really deeply what they're trying to do, and work with them kind of from the beginning, where it's just an idea, all the way to the end, where it's then in production, and hopefully everything's working. So, it's that end-to-end journey, building relationships, and seeing more than just that one project, and that was an important part for me. It's been an important part in previous roles, so looking forward to doing that again in this role here as well.
Okay, great. So how about your blog?
Yeah, the blog itself is going well. I think again that's something we've been talking about. Um, it was funny, like I think it was earlier this month, so the 1st of March. I've actually been doing this for a year now, and I was looking through some of my older content and just some of the things that I learned. So I started off doing it as podcasts. I've had many failed attempts at putting a blog together. And I think that's really important for people to understand and call out is that whilst this all looks pretty good now, I've had many failed attempts to get here. It's not just like day one, everything works. There is definitely a learning journey to this. So I develop a load of different content. It includes vlogs, so video logs, blogs, like the kind of written format stuff, and then also a series of shorter content then as well, and podcasts. So a lot of my content is focused around things like DevOps, for example. So we'll be talking about that today, of course. I did this session yesterday, like a 5-minute deep talk all around how Git works inside. And that's going really well, actually, getting lots of likes on that one, which is good. But then talk about all different things like using Terraform clouds to deploy to Azure, for example, using Git LFS to release my podcast audio to my site as well, because the static content, the website itself, is easy. Lots of people do that with DevOps. But then when you start thinking about large binary files and all these other things, it gets a bit harder. So things like DevOps, I talk a lot about. Things like architecture and architectural patterns, I talk about a lot. We talked about that last time as well on the show. And yeah, I think it's something I'm passionate about and just want to share all about it to the community. So if anyone's interested, cloudwithchris.com. And I am on YouTube as well. So if you're interested, please follow there. That's definitely an area of focus for me. But plenty of different platforms: Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, etc. So no matter what platform, if you listen or watch, there's a platform for you to listen in. So that's my plug done.
By the way, your blog site looks like the corporate site more than a blog. It's very professional.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have an older version of it available. I don't think I do. But the version that I used to use, if I just go to GitHub here, actually. So my website uses, here we go, a static content website generator called Hugo. So it takes a load of markdown files, assets, etc., and converts it into a website. So Matt Stratton, who's a well-known developer relations folk on Twitter, he does some of the DevOps days, etc. He actually made this theme. It's called Hugo Cast. It's a theme for Hugo. And I originally used this one, and it was very good. Has a lot of great features, like the podcasting functionality, generating RSS feeds for the podcasts. But like you say, I think for me, was something that was really important was I was building my brand on YouTube. I was building that Cloud with Chris kind of light blue, the logo. So I really wanted to get something which was more aligned to my brand. And that's when I started the journey to build the site. And I'm not a graphic designer or a UI designer. It took a bit of time and iteration to get this right. And I'm still working on things as well. Like in my development site at the moment, I'm actually working on some search functionality to try and bring that in as well. So growing over time, and I think that links in nicely actually to DevOps, right? That it's not, you need to have everything done at once. You have increments, you keep growing and changing things over time, seeing what works, learning from that, failing and trying again. And I think that tells the DevOps story quite nicely there as well.
When I say Azure and DevOps same sentence, lots of people say, okay, I know you want to talk about Azure DevOps, but there are lots of options on Azure about DevOps, and DevOps is a huge topic.
Yes.
So can you give some examples about these options on Azure?
Absolutely. So I think it's important before we start talking technology just to talk about DevOps in general as well. And for anyone who's listens to Build or Ignite or one of those conferences, they may know Donovan Brown and the quote that he gives about DevOps being the union of people, process, and technology to deliver value to end users. There's a really important bit at the end of that statement there. Delivering value to end users. It's not about delivering code. It's not about building infrastructure. It's really focusing all about the end user as part of your development cycle, making sure that every choice that you make as part of your development is making the experience better for the end user. So when you think about it that way, really anything could really be considered a benefit for DevOps, right? If I'm, for example, the website that we're looking at here, if we're making that look better, for example, is that a better user experience for my end users? When I look, for example, at the inspect, I don't have it installed at the moment, but there's a great tool called Google Lighthouse where you can go and look at like website accessibility, for example. That's something that I have as part of my pipelines. So really, when you start thinking about the end user and how you deliver value to them, is it accessibility? Is it how quickly the website loads up? Is it the fact that the website is resilient and thinking about architecture concepts again? keeping that end user as part of that can make you, think about those different options really and what DevOps really means. So if we dive into the technology side of it, I guess, there's the obvious scenarios, right? Like Azure DevOps, GitHub, and these kinds of scenarios as well. But there's also this this elephant in the room called monitoring, right? Monitoring is such a big topic on its own right. And I think sometimes people think about monitoring as a separate topic. But what people need to think about is this figure of eight, this infinity diagram for DevOps, where you start off with like the plan stage, you go to the develop, you go to the code, and then you kind of go to the release and the monitoring step. When we think about that iterative development cycle, it's really important to focus on that monitoring step. What happens when we've made a change and deployed it to our end users? Do they use the service and the product or the application or the website as much as they did before? Are there certain pages they use less? They use more now? What does that experience look like? And when you can start being very metric driven and very detailed around that and letting that drive your design and development and your planning, that's where this iterative development really goes strongly. So monitoring things like Azure Monitor, Application Insights, and being able to use any kind of monitoring technologies, New Relic, Datadog, all of these other kind of technologies that are out there, right? Even things like Grafana and the Elastic kind of stack as well. They're all different tools that you can use to start understanding what's going in your system. There's obviously different pros and cons to each of those, but it's really important just to understand what is actually going on in the system overall, what is happening. If you don't have that understanding, how do you know that there's a good experience for your end users? How do you know they're actually, enjoying the application that you've written and put together? So that's something which is worth considering, how you then use the monitoring and put it into that next plan. Because there's actually a really nice set of patterns in the DevOps world as well. Thinking about things like blue-green testing, A/B testing as well, these kind of things, where you can route certain users to different implementations of your website as well. And you can do things really intelligently, understanding how long they're on certain pages compared to one version or another of the website. And that's where you can start, again, being really data-driven, understand, right, we've planned this new version of the website, but actually our users don't like it. Our users aren't engaging with it at all. So actually, we need to go and make some changes. Or maybe we don't make changes. Maybe we just fail, abandon those changes, and just keep things as they are today because our users are okay with that. So monitoring is a huge part of that, and I'm sure we'll come back to that a bit later as well. I also think that a lot of people think about DevOps from the dev side of things. When you think about Docker, for example, and Kubernetes, a topic I know you're very interested in as well, a lot of people always approach it from the dev side of things. So, how do I build my application into a Docker container, for example? How do I go and deploy that? What's the life cycle of that? How do I go and do my application updates, for example? But it's interesting, like some things that I've heard in my discussions are, do I need things like antivirus scanning? Do I need things like, all these infrastructure kind of considerations that I have with virtual machines? Do I need those? And I think that's because we see a lot of people regularly think about DevOps from the dev side of things. It's DevOps, not just a big dev and then ops over there. It's both dev and ops, right? So the infrastructure side is just as important, and that operations side of things as well. And I think where you can go and automate as much of that as possible is really important. So if we think about something like, I don't know, Azure Automation, Azure Functions, Logic Apps, for example, they are all really good tools to help you automate some of that operation, which might be tedious and might not be as exciting as building the great system that you want to go and build, right? It's one of those things that sometimes you need to keep the lights on of the system. You need to spend that time just keeping the system running. But if you can actually start automating some of that, can you then start doing some brand new things for the application, delivering value to the end users? And we're back into that DevOps cycle once again. So I can talk for hours and hours about this, but I'll stop there. But maybe something we can revisit in a bit is Logic Apps, because I think that's an interesting tool for automation as well as part of that story.
Okay. Azure is huge, and there are lots of options we can use about DevOps, and there are lots of open source projects. How we can choose the right tools or right projects, right resource on Azure to use?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So I guess if we look first at like the kind of deployment tooling, you might have things like Jenkins, Azure DevOps, GitLab, GitHub. I find a lot of organizations already have some kind of tooling. And if they do, I think what they first need to look at is it broke? And if it's not broke, do you need to fix it? Is the first question, because you'll have some skills internally, right, with that tool already. So understanding what the skill set is of the team and building upon that, I think, is a good first step. But if you don't have that tooling already in place, you need to, like anything, you need to look at the functionality between the different tools. One that I'm seeing a lot of questions being asked around at the moment is Azure DevOps and GitHub, because Microsoft now owns GitHub, obviously very similar in terms of the different tools. So which one is right for me? And I think they are still both great tools, but they have different niches as well. So for example, with Azure DevOps, when you decide that you want to go and use Azure DevOps, you deploy your Azure DevOps service, instance, however you want to call it, in a particular region. You can't do that with GitHub Enterprise Cloud. You can't do that with GitHub.com. If you wanted to do that, you'd need to go and use GitHub Enterprise Server, for example. So you're managing infrastructure. So that's kind of one difference at the moment. But then when you start looking at Azure DevOps has a lot of granularity from things like permissions, role-based access control, and enterprise control that you don't have the same level of granularity in GitHub at the moment as well. So I think depending on the exact use case and what you're looking for, you'll probably have this kind of mix of different scenarios. I think one thing about GitHub is awesome at this kind of open source scenario, of course, right? We're all used to it in the open source world. Can you bring that model and that mentality to inner sourcing? And I think that's where the value then of GitHub really comes in, like this kind of social platform to do development on, as opposed to Azure DevOps, which is a bit more kind of enterprise in feel and nature. And I think GitHub is absolutely awesome for DevSecOps as well. You've got things like Dependabot, you've got CodeQL. There's some really awesome functionality on GitHub that isn't quite there out of the box in Azure DevOps. So I think, again, there's some differences depending on exactly the scenario you're looking at. So you'd need to go and look case by case and see which one works for you. And then I think if we look in the Azure space, if we think about DevOps in general, I think DevOps isn't just about the deployment. It's not just about CI/CD. It's about monitoring, like we talked about earlier. So understanding which monitoring tool is the right fit for you and the best fit, but also then the underlying platform that you're going to be hosting your applications on. Could I run my application on app services? I know you gave a great demo the other day about deploying app services with VS Code. What about Kubernetes? What about Azure Functions or Logic Apps or all these other choices? And I think, it is obviously a vast landscape. There's a lot there, but there are tools to help you decide that. I think there's some great content in the Azure Architecture Center. There is, I think we spoke about the Azure Architecture Center last time. There is a great page on there to decide the different compute options, for example. So, do you need to go down and use containers, for example? Okay. Do you need to use many different containers at the same time and have a hosted platform? Then maybe that might be AKS. Or maybe you could go app services, because app services has a container model as well. And I think ultimately it then comes down to, what are you trying to build? And when you understand your application and what it is you're trying to build, that will point you in a certain direction. We talked about it last time, and I'll bring it up again, but requirements are really, really important in that scenario. Because if I've got an application which is not stateless, for example, it's stateful, and maybe we don't want containers dying and disappearing every so often. We don't want scale automatically happening. We need it to be quite static and quite fixed as an environment. Is that the right scenario for something like Kubernetes and a cloud native scenario? It might not be. So I think there's an element of it does depend on the application that you're talking about. But there's also, as I say, information out there to help you decide between those different options at the Azure Architecture Center. And while we're talking, I'll see if I can dig that out and bring that up for folks as well. Let me see. Here we go. This is the one that I'm talking about here. So in the Azure Architecture Center, in the Application Architecture Guide, there's a section on choosing a compute service, choosing a data store, and all these other kind of services as well that you might use. And you can start from the top. Are you migrating or building new? We're building new. Do you require full control? And then you can follow the flowchart down and arrive where you want to go. So I think, there are resources out there to help you, but you also need to understand your application and what it is you're trying to achieve and do there as well.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you about a question for GitHub and
Sure.
I think one difference is using the old school TFEC on Azure Devops. And also people think that we should migrate to Git. Git is better, Git is very popular. And I want to ask, why should I migrate to Git, or why shouldn't I migrate to Git?
Yeah, good question. So I guess TFVC, for anyone who doesn't know, by the way, Team Foundation Version Control, originated from Team Foundation Server, so TFS, which has kind of evolved into what Azure DevOps is today. Git has been around actually for quite a while. I think it's really grown in popularity over the last 5 years or so. And when you think about TFVC, typically it's used in this kind of centralized model. It's typically used in a way where you have this central server. And then as an end user, if I want to go and edit a file, I have to go and kind of check out that file, take that file, and then it's locked. No one else can go and use that. So if we think in the scenario where we've got a big development team and they all have dependencies on the same file, there's going to be some contention there because, I come along, I want to edit that file, and I find Mert is already, locking that file because he's editing it. So I can't be productive. I can't carry on. And I know there are ways around it. I know, there are things that you can do in TFEC, but that's kind of one of the foundational pieces around it, is that kind of centralized mechanism of working. Compare that to Git. Git is all about a kind of decentralized way of working. So rather than having this one central server that we all have to work from, we each have our own individual repository on our machine. So Mert, you have a repository cloned on your machine. I have a repository cloned on my machine. And when we're working, we push up to some location. And that just happens to be the same central location that we're all working from. The other thing about Git as well is that it's very, very efficient. It does a lot of great stuff in terms of compressing the files that it stores, in terms of how it can go ahead and I don't know if deduplify is the right word or deduplicate is the right word. But imagine that I've added a file called hello world. And in that file, I just have the text hello world. And then I rename it to like hello world new, for example. Don't change the contents, just keep it exactly the same. Rather than storing that file again, Git uses hashes and pointers and all these other clever things to realize actually that is the same contents of the file. So rather than add it again, we'll just point to that same backend instance. So in terms of optimizing as well, really, really clever from that perspective and really well proven, I think, when you look at some of the code bases in the world that now run on Git as well. And I think when you look at services like Azure DevOps, where when you look at some of the functionality for TFVC, for example, I don't believe the pull request functionality is available for TFVC. It's only available for Git. And when you look at services like GitHub, which only offer Git, and just the amount of momentum behind Git, I think it's clearly, becoming that industry standard that everyone is kind of jumping onto and using. So I think there's many great reasons for using Git, and I'm a big fan of it as well. Like I was saying just before we went live, I yesterday released a video all about like the Git internals and how Git works, a bit more expanded of what we were just talking about. And it's really powerful set of tools, and I think it's getting a lot of love and investment from the community as well, because it is this kind of open source set of tools as well. So again, it's driving the community that it's trying to make as well. I think it's great set of tools. So hopefully that answers the question at least.
Great, thank you. So Azure DevOps has different products, so Azure Boards, Azure Pipelines, Artifacts. And is it possible to use, for example, I want to use Azure Repos, but I don't want to use Azure Boards. I want to use different products, or I want to use Azure Artifacts, but I'm not going to use Azure Repos. Is it possible, or
Yeah, absolutely.
Advantages to use different products?
Yeah, great question. Great question. I think there are advantages to use, parts of Azure DevOps, parts of GitHub. If we come back to the point I made earlier about like the inner sourcing, if you think about Azure DevOps is very project based and project focused. So the permissions that you'll give are probably on a project by project basis, whereas GitHub is a bit more about organizations, and then you have the repositories underneath that. So it really allows this idea of inner sourcing. So if we've got a private organization, then maybe I can discover projects that other people within my organization are working on, and we can learn from each other, for example. Compare that with Azure DevOps or Azure repos in particular. I think there's a lot of granularity in the permissions that you can grant to Azure repos, for example. You don't quite get the same level of granularity in GitHub repositories, for example. So I think that's, for example, maybe something how I would contrast the two there. When you look at something like Azure Boards, for example, you can actually link Azure Boards to GitHub issues as well. There's a way to do that. And when you link the GitHub repository to your Azure Boards, you can actually use a specific tag in your GitHub issue to link that to one of your Azure board work items and vice versa as well. So there is that linking as well. Or, of course, you can use one or the other. But the nice thing about that particular linking, for example, is let's say you've got, I don't know, some kind of scenario where you've got a project which you want to be publicly available to end customers or end users, and you want to link that back to your internal environment where you're tracking all your work items, using Azure Boards, for example. Well, you can absolutely have the public repository for that environment for your end users, and then link those GitHub issues to the Azure Boards, and you can track your internal work on the Azure Boards and keep the end customers up to date then on the GitHub issues then as well. So that's some quite nice integration and functionality there. Pipelines and GitHub Actions. I think that's an interesting one because pipelines, I think, has really evolved over the last few years. And GitHub Actions is really still on that journey of evolving and growing. So, for example, over the last 3-4 months, just before Christmas, the functionality for environments was just introduced. For example, so you didn't have the concept of environments, you didn't have the concept of manual approvers until just before Christmas. That is now available in GitHub Actions, whereas that has been in Azure Pipelines for quite some time. So it's a bit more mature, for example. So you also have these different types of checks that you can use in Azure Pipelines as well, which you don't have in GitHub Actions yet. But the thing that is nice about GitHub Actions, and this was something where we delivered some sessions last week that I talked about, is the way that GitHub Actions works in terms of the actions themselves. So all of the GitHub Actions are actually just GitHub repositories. So as long as someone's published the GitHub repository or you have access to the GitHub repository, you can go ahead and reference that GitHub action. It happens there's a marketplace that you can list all of those actions on, but I as an end user can publish my own actions. Obviously, there's something you need to be careful of with like dependencies and supply chain, because do you necessarily trust the actions that I put out to the world? Or do you trust the ones that come from Microsoft Azure, for example? There's obviously a difference there on dependencies. But I think what that allows is a really rich and great ecosystem. And when we think about GitHub and this kind of open source idea and this community of open source people, the way they're building GitHub Actions to consume from GitHub repositories, I think makes complete sense. And that I find really exciting, actually. I think that's a really interesting way of building the platform and allowing people to expand the platform. And of course, anyone can go and make extensions for Azure DevOps. That is also an approach. And on both platforms, you can run basic command line as well. So, they're quite comparable in that sense. I think you're going to just see some maturity differences there, like on the permissions, again, the granularity of control. In Azure Pipelines, you can control on a per environment basis quite granularly the different permissions that you want, for example. So I think there is some differences between those side of things. And then on the artifacts and the package registry side of things, very similar. At the end of the day, they're package registries, right? I think there may be some slight differences on what packages can be stored in which service. I can't remember off the top of my head which are in either one. But I think even the granularity of the permissions is fairly similar between those two. I think ultimately what you'd want to consider at that point is where your build's running and having them kind of closer to where your code is, to be quite honest. There may be other considerations, but the top of my head, they don't jump out at me. I guess, yeah, it would be that scenario wherever your code and your build would be running, having it closer to potentially those build agents so that you're reducing any latency for your builds to run, for example. You could argue things like caching as well could help, but that might just be an extra consideration. So we talked about repos, we talked about pipelines, talked about artifacts, and we talked about boards. I guess the other one is test plans. And test plans, I don't really see there being an equivalent in GitHub. And test plans is really all about the manual testing rather than the automated testing. If you're thinking about like unit testing, integration testing, all of those things, you can link them into the test plans that you have, but you typically execute those through like an Azure pipeline or a GitHub action, for example. Test plans really shines in terms of the kind of user acceptance testing. I'm a tester. I need to follow my test plan, a set of scripts, designing that and having it in a way that I can share that across my team. That's what test plans is all about. And I don't really see an equivalent for that in GitHub. So that might still be something you'd need to look at Azure DevOps for at the moment, I think. But hopefully that gives an equivalent of all of the two, how I see it. It's an interesting space at the moment, I think. And I think there's just some great tools on either service for everyone to go and use. So definitely take a look at both, because I think depending on the requirements, you could decide to go in either direction, I think.
Okay, thank you for your great explanation. And I have a hard question for you.
Uh-oh.
Okay, ready?
I think so.
When people ask about content orchestration, and the general answer is they use Kubernetes. And if someone asks Azure and content orchestration, the general answer is AKS and Azure service. But there's another option in Azure Service Fabric. I think it is not a very well-known resource. So can you give us some examples, just use scenarios, or the differences between AKS and Service Fabric?
Yeah, sure. So, Service Fabric isn't a new technology. Service Fabric has been around for a few years now, because as you can kind of identify by the name, Service Fabric, it's kind of being used by Microsoft for several services, right? So I think one of the most famous ones was Halo, actually. And I think it was Halo 5, if I remember rightly. They made a big thing about how Service Fabric is being used. And I think if you compare them directly, in fact, actually, let's step back a moment. Service Fabric wasn't originally a container orchestrator. I think that's where this comparing the two has started coming in. So originally, you had a number of different services on Service Fabric. They're called actors, they're called reliable services. And I think I forget, there was a reliable executable or something similar. Um, the containers functionality came along a lot later. So I think comparing them as a container orchestrator almost devalues Service Fabric a little bit, because it can do so much more. Coming back to the point with Halo, the way that Halo works under the covers is they use this model called the actors framework. It's something that is available in Service Fabric, and Halo helped bring it into Service Fabric because of the implementation. Really, really interesting space, actually. If anyone's interested in like the computer science and the theory behind it all, there's a project called Orleans. Take a look at that from Microsoft. It's really interesting, some of the papers around that, which is all about this actors framework. And what it is every single object in a game, for example, would be represented inside this cluster. So I am Chris, I am a player, I have a gun, I have grenades, I have all these things. Mert is another player. I throw a grenade, what happens? Those two actors interact with each other, something happens. So when you think about gaming, for example, state is really important, and making sure that you're bringing down that latency as much as you can, because what you don't want is a scenario where Chris is in Halo, fires his gun, and then Mert has jumped halfway across the field because of lag or latency. That's a poor end user experience. Thinking back to DevOps once again, that end user experience. So having that state being easily replicated locally is important, and that's where something like Service Fabric really, really shines, through something like the Actors framework, or reliable services, reliable frameworks, etc. But Kubernetes, I think, is really, in my opinion, a strong orchestrator from a container perspective, because that's where it began, that's where it grew up, when it was Borg inside of Google, and then they obviously took that and evolved it into what Kubernetes is today. Still growing, still evolving, of course, as well. But I think as a container orchestrator, it's brilliant. And I'll share my secret about Kubernetes, that I always say to people that Kubernetes is just a big desired state machine. That's all it is. You have an API endpoint, you tell it what you want. Inside its brain, it knows I have 5 containers running right now, but the user has just told me we need 10. So I need to now go and make that thing happen. And that's all Kubernetes is just a big desired state machine. And when you start looking at the architecture of it, it makes a lot of sense how it works. But what Kubernetes doesn't have necessarily built into it is some of that state side of things that we just talked about with Service Fabric. You know, what you hear a lot about in the container space is containers are really good for stateless workloads. But when you start wanting to run stateful workloads, it can get quite complicated and complex quite quickly. So I think that would be one of the differences. But there is this open source project actually from Microsoft, which starts blurring the lines a little bit. And there's this this project called Dapper. I think it stands for Distributed Application Runtime, if I remember rightly. And if you think about some of the common features, for example, like retrying and timeouts and circuit breakers and some of those state-based things, for example, some of that is kind of implemented inside of this Dapper project. So it's a way that you can actually bring a sidecar to your application container and get some of that benefit that we were talking about from the Service Fabric side of things. So I think those lines may start getting a bit more gray. But I think, you know, when you look at the types of services that run with Service Fabric, I think there are many others. In the past, I've seen like I think Event Hubs or similar, if I remember rightly, they did some case studies on. So it's a really proven set of technologies if you need to have this very reliable, robust, low latency kind of application. Whereas if you want something to be more in the, let's say, the cloud native space, and it's a lot more in the open source territory, so you want to be cloud agnostic, for example, even though you can run Service Fabric anywhere, Kubernetes is a good choice from that perspective as well. So I think, again, they have their pros and cons. It just depends on really the scenario that you're building, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. So what about the cursor? Because people think that it's a basic version of orchestration. Is that true?
They think
Which scenarios we should choose the cursor?
choose which one. Sorry, Mert.
So, for example, I want a container orchestration.
Yes.
Should I choose the cursor or Kubernetes?
I think in general, Kubernetes is a good choice for container orchestration. And I think because it's just so well proven as a container orchestrator. The difference between something like Service Fabric as well and Kubernetes is that Service Fabric has Microsoft behind it, right? But Microsoft is the one who invests in Service Fabric. Kubernetes has the whole community behind it, has the whole, loads of different companies invested in it. And of course, you've got Azure Kubernetes Service, again, a great platform. You've got GKE, you've got EKS, all of these managed platforms. So I think it's kind of clear that Kubernetes is becoming this very well-known orchestrator in the container space. You, of course, have things like Docker Swarm, Apache Mesos as well, for example, Mesosphere. I think that Kubernetes has just become this platform now, which is synonymous with containers, right? When you hear someone say containers, the next word typically is Kubernetes because it's just so well known now. And I think that's just where so many people have started adopting it, using it, and are evangelizing it and advocating it to others. What I would say, though, in container orchestration overall, is be careful about jumping in too quickly. And what I mean by that is if I'm deploying my Cloud with Chris website, do I need a Kubernetes cluster for that? No, because it's just one website. It's very lightweight. It's all static content. I can put that in a storage account and CDN, and it works fine. It works brilliantly. If I have one single container, do I need Kubernetes? Probably not, because it's one single container. Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms, not a platform for building applications. That's a really important distinction that when you listen to some of the people in the Kubernetes community speak, they talk all about Kubernetes being this platform for building platforms. So if you've got a series of microservices and you want to have a consistent way of deploying and managing and orchestrating them, Kubernetes makes sense. But if it's a really small, simple, lightweight project, could you deploy the container into app service or Azure Container Instances or something else? So just bear in mind the level of complexity that you start taking on when you go down Kubernetes, because it's not just about knowing containers. It's about knowing how Kubernetes works and then how you do logging in a cloud native environment and networking and all these open source projects that start coming in. And then suddenly you've got this whole environment that you need to start managing. And it's quite an undertaking. And that's not to scare anyone away at all. It's just to be realistic that it's slightly higher up the stack than infrastructure as a service. And platforms like AKS, GKE, EKS do a really great job at reducing some of the complexity of managing an AKS cluster. Oh, sorry, managing a Kubernetes cluster. But there is still complexity. And not all of that is taken away. And someone still has to manage and operate that. And coming back to DevOps, who is it going to be? It's probably not going to be the developers. The developers will probably deploy to it, but the operators need to go and manage and maintain that. How well connected are they? And it gets even more important in that cloud native world with those shared responsibilities there. So a great orchestrator, a great tool. I've used it many times. I've got my own cluster spun up at the moment. But make sure you use it in a scenario that makes sense, not just for like a simple container scenario, but if you're needing an environment where you're building a platform, then maybe it starts making sense.
Yes, and thank you very much. This was a great conversation.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Mert. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be on the show and always great to have these brilliant discussions. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. See you. Cheers.
Bye.